All right, last time we started into a section I've got titled The Prelude to the War for Independence. So let's see who remembers something. Tell me about King George III. Yes. Very controlling, very domineering, controlling person, and he tried to extend that control to the colonies. Other things.
It's from the Hanoverian line of kings.
The Hanoverian, yes.
He was the first one who grew up in England.
Yeah. There's a German line of kings. The first two Georges were born in Germany and much more concerned with that. He's born in England, speaks English, kind of a nice thing for the English king. All right, then we got to Lord Grenville. He becomes the prime minister in 1763, and he implements a program here of several different things addressing the colonies. What was the first thing we talked about there involving the trade laws? Some of you had the response that England had up until this point about trade laws, kind of the yawn and disinterest. But how did that change here? Yes. Okay, we need to want to actually enforce these things. All right. There had been laws in the books before that were very, very loosely enforced. I don't want to ask what laws in the dorm are stated but not enforced. But you can probably think of something that's stated. There's this rule, and some of you are coughing, and it never really gets followed and never really gets enforced, and so it just kind of let go. There was this attempt here to clamp down on this thing. So we have that change taking place. And we have the proclamation of 1763 that cut off all the land in the Ohio River Valley, basically, from the colonists. And then the last thing we saw was a tax on a particular item that took me a long time to get somebody to tell me what the item was. We want to do it a little quicker today. Sugar, a tax on sugar. Sugar and other sugar products, a tax on them. Why was the Sugar Act significant? There had been other taxes before.
It was the British's first attempt to tax just for revenue.
Yeah, this is purely for revenue. In your pleasure reading, when you pick out Dickinson and others to read them, you'll see them making this point. They were completely fine with mercantilism for the most part, and laws set up to regulate trade and that type of stuff, and even some taxes to pay for enforcing that regulation. They were fine with that. But when it came to England, taxing purely to make money for England, just as tax, as we think of a tax more instead of more of a fee to cover the expenses, that was a significant change, and it is something. It's not just something that we look back on and we kind of are trying to figure out why were they mad. You can read their writings, and you can see that this was a tax for revenue. It was a new thing. So that was the first one, purely for revenue. All right, there's three more things here that Grenville pushes through Parliament that we need to talk about, and then we'll look at how the colonists respond to these things. Basically, they get very upset. Lord Shaftesbury, I think is his name, in Parliament, he defended the colonists and all this, and he described the colonists as having been driven mad. All right, he says, yeah, they get a little bit upset. You know, there's these massacres and some teeth thrown in the harbor. He said, they've been driven mad. What do you expect? All right, so there's some emotion here, but we'll look at it, the response in a second. So, all right, the three other things here with Grenville's program. The next one is the Currency Act of 1876. The Currency Act of 1876. Is this mandating direct or alternating current? Electricity, if you're wondering. Is it about electricity? So it has to do with money, all right? And it said two things. One, it said the colonists couldn't print their own paper money, which had to happen. I mean, it wasn't illegal. They had, many of the colonies had their own currency, so they couldn't print that. And then the other half of it was the colonists could not pay any debts to English merchants with that colonial currency. So they didn't have to burn their currency. I mean, it still had value, but they couldn't make any new currency, and they couldn't use that currency to pay British merchants. They had to come up with British currency, the pounds. which was difficult. Imagine if, Pastor Armacost said that you can only pay your school bill in Russian rubles. Where do I get them? We could get them, but it would be a headache to try to get them, all right? And the British pounds would have been a little more accessible than Russian rubles for us, but you can kind of see it was a headache. All right, how do we get the right currency to go pay this British merchant? The British merchant could pay them in colonial currency, but he had to come up with British pounds to pay them back. So anyway, an extra headache for sure. All right, so that was the Currency Act. That was in 1764. The next one is the Stamp Act of 1765. And this one is especially aggravating to the colonists, much more abrasive to them. All right, the Stamp Act, it said that all kinds of different documents had to have a stamp on them that you had to pay to get. Right? Think of an imprint in the paper. You might have seen an old birth certificate or something with an imprint in it. That type of stamp. These weren't scratch and sniffs or something like that. It was a stamp in the paper. And newspapers, legal documents, if you took out a mortgage on your house, they would have to get stamped. There was all kinds of things had to get stamped. And you had to pay to get the stamp. So it was a tax in the form of this stamp. Okay, so that was one facet here. This was a tax, right? That was of issue. And this one was much more in the face of the colonists. The Sugar Act, that was the tax as the stuff came into the harbor. Right? When you went to the grocery store, you weren't having to fork out money to the customs official to pay for your sugar tax. That was done at the harbor. This, everybody had to pay. So it was much more, everybody was done with this directly. It was hard to kind of in your mind say, well, that's in the harbor. I don't live near the harbor. It wasn't a big deal. But it was a tax. That was one facet of this that was significant. The other facet of it that was another layer of aggravation and violation of British law was that those who broke this were tried without a jury. They were tried without a jury. If I remember correctly, they used the military courts to try them. All right, and that is, I'm sure that after you get done reading Dickinson and others, you go back and read the Magna Carta and the English Bill of Rights and some of those things. But in there, one of the things that the English were fighting for was the trial by jury, to be tried by their peers. And that was something that they had fought hard for in England. And these people were promised that they're going to be treated just like the people in England, and all of a sudden these things are being stripped away from them. Okay, so the Stamp Act, we're going to see it arouses or gets the most attention and most aggravation because it's very much right in their face. And we also have this trial without a jury layered on top of the taxation without representation. All right, we'll get to that response in a second. So that was the Stamp Act of 1776. The last thing is the Quartering Act. I'm sorry, Stamp Act of what did I say? 65. I thought I said 76 for a second there. 65. And the Quartering Act was also 65. All right, this had to do with making the colonists house British troops. Each state was, given a certain allotment of troops, and they had to provide housing for them, feed them, that type of thing. I've recently been able to look up John Dickinson's writings. We'll talk about him and read down through some of those things. And he talks about this Quartering Act. And he says, does it really matter how they take the money out of her pocket? If they pass a tax and take it directly with the tax, or they say, you've got to house and feed the troops. The money's coming out of her pocket no matter how you slice it. Right? So he was coming down on this the tax. But this also is a violation beyond the taxation side. In Great Britain and England, they were not allowed to be forced to quarter soldiers. Right? Parliament couldn't take a section of Great Britain and say, all right, here's your soldiers, keep them through the winter, we want them in the spring, fed and happy. All right, that couldn't happen there. There were laws against quartering in the English Bill of Rights and other things. It talks about no quartering of soldiers, but they were being forced to. A lot of the colonies just comply. Some of them don't. New York doesn't, and they actually get in trouble. England comes after them later because they don't supply them with all the things that they thought they should be supplied with. So England gets much more aggressive with this quartering stuff, and eventually gets to the point where the general basically could go through town and say, "Oh, you've got an empty barn. We're going to put 10 soldiers there. They want breakfast at 8." It very much allowing them to sleep more in private dwellings and taverns and that type of thing. At this point, it was mostly, build them a big shed out back, or put a barn up, let them sleep someplace. That type of thing. It is funny. Several places when the generals or whoever went to try to find people to build these structures or buy the material to build the structures, all of a sudden everybody was booked. All the carpenters, man, flipping out their phone and scrolling through it. Wow, maybe next June I could work on this. And the hardware stores, oh man, we have no wood. Look, the sawmill just broke down. We have to go to England to get parts for that. All of a sudden, major complications was getting this stuff done. But anyway, the Quartering Act, it was a violation of British law. This was something that could not be done in England. It was against the law there, but they were doing it to them. So, Grenville's program. Questions there? Yes? 1764. I don't have the particular day that they passed, but you can find that if you want. It's not that hard. I do have the Stamp Act. Went into effect on November the 1st of 65. And on that day, churches would toll their bells like it was a funeral, and it was a very ominous day for them. And it's good to try to go back and try to feel the emotion. When here we've got Great Britain taxing, stripping away the trial by jury, it would have been a very somber day. If you were old enough to be aware of the world beyond, your lunch table in high school or junior high, wherever you were, on the day Obamacare passed or something like that, it was one of those things like you think, wow, how could we do that? How could that happen? It would have been that type of feeling there. So, all right, let's talk about how the colonists responded to this thing. Mostly they didn't like it, all right, but we'll give some details about some of their response to it. All right, the first thing we'll talk about is the Sugar Act. All right, and that was the very first tax purely for revenue. And just one thing to mention there. The legislature of New York passed an official condemnation of this, stating that there should be no taxation without representation. Now, it might seem like a no big deal, like, well, okay, it's just a statement. But we're all talking about a legislative body. And if you know much about how legislative bodies work, it's amazing that they decide how to turn the lights on in the morning. They're kind of cumbersome creatures. And then the fact here that they are condemning an action of England. They'd be like please don't do this, like you guys getting together and in the dorm and writing up an official document condemning Mr. Schrock's governance of the dorm for some reason. He's been no laundry, free laundry or something. They're being taxed to do your laundry by having to put quarters in a machine. Somehow you write up this document condemning how Mr. Schrock organizes the dorm, and you send it off to Mr. Schrock. Right. There's a little bit, that's just, Jimmy's thinking, I don't want to do that. Right? But you can get the idea that, them making this statement, it's much more than just, oh yeah, let's write a document. They are disagreeing with the way that Great Britain's ruling, right? So that is significant. So we have that official condemnation there, a document produced by the New York legislature condemning this. It's also New York that doesn't comply with the Quartering Act, and that legislature body gets suspended here in a few years. But that's down the road. All right, the next thing to talk about is the Stamp Act. This one gets the most attention, the most emotion involved here, and for good reason. Let me see if I can help you think about it. Let's pretend that the governor of Indiana passes a law that, I don't know, what's something we would do? You can't attend church more than 2 times a week. I hope you're thinking, whoa, I do that more than 2 times a week. All right, but he says, for the trial, we're just going to use the existing court systems. So if you go to church 3 times a week, the police come after our entire church, drag us off. We're going to be tried here in town in the local court systems. And we might think, okay, well, there's going to be people we know, then, we can get a fair trial, and they're going to say this is a crazy law and throw it out. If you can imagine the governor making that type of rule and saying, I've got this special court system, we're going to drag some UN soldiers in, and they're going to hold the trial for you. Does anybody see how that all of a sudden becomes a very different situation? Right. The trials were the British military. It was their military trials. All right. So you have this egregious law, and then almost guaranteed guilty if you get arrested for this. So this, for a very good reason, gets people's attention. All right. So some of the response to this. One is the Sons of Liberty were formed. This is one of those emotionally charged groups that did all kinds of things. This was started by Samuel Adams. The fact that his name is now on a beer might have something to do with the chaotic nature of the Sons of Liberty. They were emotional. They had parades. They would protest. Samuel Adams and at least the leadership were not really calling for violence, although there was some violence done. The stamp offices torn down and things like that. They were not necessarily calling for that, but there was some real emotional protest here with these Sons of Liberty. So they started here in response to this, and they are involved throughout this whole process with it. So the Sons of Liberty are formed. The second thing is some of that violence. The stamp collectors had all kinds of fun things happen to them, or they're a dummy that looked like them. They'd make a dummy that looked like one of the stamp collectors and take it to the town square and put it on a stake and burn it, or tar and feather it. That type of fun stuff. Some of the tax stamp offices were torn down. So there's that type of violence. Again, the Sons of Liberty were not advocating that, but that type of stuff did happen. That was what Lord Shaftesbury was saying about they've been driven mad by injustice. There was some people went over the edge a little bit. All right, so we have the stamp collectors and that type of thing done to them. We also have flags being flown at half-mast and funeral bells being played here the day that the law went into effect. Think of 9/11 or something like that, some national tragedy when the flags are down, but this is recognizing in a lot of people's mind the death of freedom. I mean, this is the death of liberty. That type of thing happened. All right, there was also one other thing here with the Stamp Act. There was also a Stamp Act Congress formed in 1765. Don't let the word Congress scare you. It's just a gathering of people. A Stamp Act meeting. Representatives from 9 of the colonies came, and they produced another document, some resolves, a statement here officially condemning, and these were their words, in opposition to the tyrannical acts of the British Parliament. All right, officially condemning this stuff. 9 of the colonies getting together to do this. All right, so those are some things more directly aimed at the Stamp Act, addressing that. So there are a couple other things here that happened from my outline. I said the Sugar Act, the Stamp Act, and this would be the third main point. Still how the colonists responded to this whole package. So, all right, the third thing was a boycott of British goods was organized, colony-wide, across all the colonies, boycotting British goods. They were intentionally trying to get a hold of the attention of the merchants in England, right? The people that elected people to Parliament. They were trying to put pressure on them, cutting off a very valuable market for them, and it was to some extent successful. Those people did recognize what was happening. So a boycott of British goods. We also have one more thing here with the colonists and how they responded was the committees of correspondence were formed, or committees. Committees of correspondence were formed. Anybody know what these things did? Something more than there were committees that corresponded. Is that it? I thought someone might know. We have the silent quarter. It goes all across the room now. All right, they were groups of people that wrote letters back and forth. That was it. The main purpose of them was to spread information about what was happening. If something happens in Boston, The other places in Massachusetts needed to be aware of what was happening, and then very quickly through all the colonies there began to be these committees. So information is getting spread here. Think of Facebook with a really slow internet connection, right? Or something like that. But there was no, they couldn't call each other. This was a method for information to be spread. So very quickly we have events taking place in Boston or New York or places like that. Everybody finding out very quickly about what's happening, especially for that time frame, very, very quickly. And the colonists beginning to see an attack on one particular city as an attack on the whole group. And these committees were very useful to spread that kind of information. Really, we take for granted, Mrs. O posts on Schoology an update for all of us. The girls' volleyball starts, I didn't even pay attention to when or what day, but I know it starts. Is it Thursday? Okay. It's easy just to throw that around, but without that type of technology, it's harder to spread that information. And this was used for that. So these committees of correspondence, they start in Massachusetts and Boston and then very quickly spread all around. All right, one other thing here to mention with this response. I have it underneath the colonial response. It really isn't colonial. It's in Great Britain, but I'll put it here. This was also very hotly debated in Parliament. The Stamp Act, the Sugar Act, the colonists responded to it, these things being repealed. This whole package was very, very hotly debated. There were members in Parliament, like Lord Shaftesbury, Edmund Burke, who very vehemently argued for the colonists, saying we're asking for trouble. We're doing things to them that our laws say aren't legal. There was very heated debate. Obviously, that side doesn't win the hour, but there was at least those voices there. All right, I've got to at least mention one more thing here. You don't have to write it down. Patrick Henry made a statement here about the Stamp Act that I love. He said that Caesar had his Brutus, Charles I his Cromwell. Does anybody know the relationship between those people? What did Brutus do to Caesar? Kill him. Charles I and Cromwell. Cromwell beheaded. They didn't shoot him, beheaded him. Same effect. And George III may profit from their example. Think of the warning he's giving to the king. As he got to Cromwell, people began to yell, treason. He's talking about killing the king. Okay. I heard it interesting once about treason. It's a crime you're only accused of if you fail. If you lead a revolution and overturn the government, then it's not treason. If you fail, then treason. And then he continued, George III may profit from their example. If this be treason, make the most of it. Right? That's he realized what he was doing. But anyway, you can sense the emotion there. Patrick Henry wasn't known for being soft-spoken either. All right, so that was Grenville. Here we have a couple of waves of problems. If Grenville gets all this stuff through Parliament, and then the fallout, and then that stuff all gets repealed, and then we have another person stepping to the front in England trying to push some things down the colony. So we have, it breaks up into some convenient chunks here, and this was the first chunk, Lord Grenville and his program. The next chunk, the next step in this thing is the guy in England that pops up, that leads the effort there, is a guy named Charles Townshend. Townshend. Charles Townshend. Those Grenville's laws get repealed, and we get a new wave of legislation here aimed at them. Charles Townshend. Anybody know what he was in charge of in England? You'd have to have learned this someplace else. I haven't talked about it yet, but anybody want to just make a wild guess? So he was in charge of the finances. If you want his official title, he was the Chancellor of the Exchequer. Sounds important. In charge of the finances. All right, so from that position, he would have been concerned about the colonists paying. All right, there were real debts England had. It had been expensive to fight the French-Indian War. They were keeping troops on the frontier to try to control the Indians and that type of thing. So there's some real expenses here. And he has actually the ones that sliding the gold coins around on his desk and paying bills, he's concerned about it. So he comes up with another set of pieces of legislation here to try to address the issue. So, all right, his splits up into just two main things. The second thing has several different parts to it, but two main things. These are passed in 1767. So we have Grenville, 63, 64, 65, his laws being passed, 65, 66, the uproar in the colonies about the injustice, very, very justly so. They get repealed, and in 67 we have another wave coming. All right, Townsend here, two main things. The first one is the New York legislature is suspended. This is the one that hadn't complied completely with the Quartering Act. They were the one that condemned the Sugar Act. So just they get evaporated. Also in your pleasure reading, once you finish up with Dickinson and the English Bill of Rights and Magna Carta, you can read the Declaration of Independence, and they reference things like this, suspending, destroying their legislative bodies and things of that nature. This is an example of that. So just gets evaporated because they didn't comply with everything that England had demanded. So that was the first thing. The second thing is the Revenue Act. You might be able to guess that it had to do with revenue, raising money. All right, this Revenue Act set up a series of import taxes on several different products. The products are not that significant, but if glass and lead and paint, paper, tea, several different things like that, an import tax on those goods. Townsend here, he felt that Parliament had the right to collect both a tax like the Stamp Act and also the Sugar Act. He didn't see the real difference, but he said, well, those crazy people over there, they got upset with the Stamp Act, an internal tax. So let's go back to this external tax, and these crazy people will calm down. There was a difference between the two, but in the minds of the colonists, it was either one was a tax. The one was much more in their face and much more emotionally charged, but both of them was a tax. So anyway, he claims that they have the right to do either one, but he was just going to do this external tax to make it easier for the colonists to swallow it. So, all right, so sets up a tax. There's several things here that follow along with this, but the first part of this Revenue Act is it was an import tax on goods being brought into the colonies. All right, the second thing it did is it also, anybody convicted or anybody accused of breaking this, not paying these taxes, was tried in those same courts that the Stamp Act would have set up. The military courts, no trial. So a trial without a jury. Again, if you can think of, our president. I shouldn't speculate. Saying if you discriminate against transgenders, then we're going to have this special UN human rights body hold the trial for you. Okay. And there, if you're a pervert and wicked and evil, they're going to praise you. And you walk in and say, "Well, I think a guy's a guy. Okay, kill him." There's going to be no fair trial at all. All right, and that's what this was. There's a tax. If you don't pay the tax and you get caught, you're going to these trials. There's no way you're getting a fair trial. All right, so very, very aggravating. All right, so we have that. We also have him sending over a whole bunch of agents to enforce this thing. This was a tax coming in all the harbors, so he sends over a swarm of agents. I've got it here. I should just read you the wording from the Declaration. For suspending our legislature, we talked about that. and sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. You gotta, I don't know. I appreciate the word picture here that they're creating. Think of like a swarm of locusts that came into Egypt or something. That was the description of these agents being sent over to the colonists to harass them and eat out their substance. So there's a whole wave of these. There was a name for them, the American Revenue Board or something like that. Sounds like a government agency, but there's a whole wave of officers sent over. So, all right, the last piece of this Revenue Act, we have the tax, we have the court system, we have the officials coming over, and the last thing was writs of assistance were used to enforce this thing. Writs of assistance. Somebody tell me about those things. Was that the day you were absent-minded in class? Writs of assistance. We talked about them at the end of the French and Indian War. It's not cheating to look. Come on, somebody. Allison?
Search warrants. They didn't have to search.
They did have a search warrant, but it was just very open-ended. Typically, a search warrant would say we're going to Allison's house and we're looking for marijuana in her bedroom. She's looking worried. How did you know? That's why she's always so happy. It'd be that type of thing. And they couldn't just go to your house and start going through the parents' bedroom and looking through the garage. They'd have to go to your bedroom, look for marijuana. If you also had cocaine sitting out on your counter, they could use that against you. But there's kind of specific about what they were looking for and where. This was not like that. It'd be much like the police being given the power to, well, just kind of look anywhere you want in Northwest Indiana for drugs. And they just wander around, bashing doors in, looking in garage. They can go to anybody's house they want, anywhere they wanted, that type of thing. All right, so they use these writs of assistance, very, very open-ended, a violation of British law. Right? Those same documents talked about before, this was not legal in England, but they're doing it here to their own citizens. All right, so writs of assistance were used. All right, who thinks the colonists are happy with the Revenue Act? It was an external tax. What's not to like? So, no, they don't swallow this one very well either. Let's talk about how they respond. The colonial response here. All right, a couple of things. First one is Massachusetts. Their legislative body officially condemns this thing. They come up with a document and they send it off to the king, and they also distribute it to all of the colonies. So this would be like you guys in the dorm getting together and writing up your document about how bad Mr. Schrock is and sending it to him, and then to bottom say, P.S. We're emailing this to every student in the college. Right, they were making it known that they were unhappy and they were letting everybody else know, not just a letter to the king. All right, so Massachusetts condemning this officially and sending it as a circular letter. Samuel Adams wrote that thing. The Massachusetts legislature gets suspended in '68 because of this. Boston, Massachusetts very quickly becomes the focal point of tensions here at this point. So we have that from Massachusetts. The second thing is a man named John Dickinson begins to write. I mentioned him a couple of times. Anybody know anything about him other than he must have written something? Because you just said he wrote. Nothing? He wrote a series of that are called this, Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania to the Inhabitants of the British Colonies. A series of 12 letters. They get published in the newspapers. It's kind of, the guy was a lawyer, but he also had a farm. So it'd be like, I fix my car every now and then, so writing a letter from a mechanic in Northwest Indiana or something. Like, well, okay, you do fix cars again. And just, he was a lawyer, had a law degree. He even starts out his first one talking about how his farm is well established and he has people to run it and he has time to sit and look at books and to write letters. So don't think here of a guy out behind a plow contemplating British law and the deeper concepts of trial without jury. But it gives that flavor in the title. Letters from a farmer in Pennsylvania to the inhabitants of the British colonies. Series of 12 letters, very interesting. They're not super deep. I'm not meaning that insult you that you can understand them, but they're pretty straightforward. But anyway, in there he makes points like Parliament does not have the right to tax us without our representation. Kind of a crazy position to take. I'm kidding. Even makes the point that the only people that could serve as our representatives were people that we choose ourselves. Again, that seems crazy, but Parliament was claiming that they were our representatives. They said, we represent the entire British Empire. We represent India, we represent you guys, we represent Great Britain, we represent everybody. And he's saying, wait a second, we didn't pick anybody. How could you be our representative? So he makes some points like that. And one point that becomes very important in a little bit is he makes the points that the colonists should not accept a low tax rate. They need to stand on the principle of Parliament does not have the right to tax us, right? And England tries that exact thing with the tea tax. They set up a system where the tea was getting taxed, but it would be cheaper than it had been before. All right, so that very thing does happen, and he spreads the idea of we don't have they can't tax us without us being represented there, and we're not just going to take the cheaper tea, literally a bribe from Great Britain. So John Dickinson, he's sometimes called the penman of the Revolution. Very influential writings. After you get done with the British documents and the Declaration of Independence, as well as the book for our class, you could look up those things, and you can find PDFs very easily. So. All right, so John Dickinson. All right, the next thing here with the colonial response, Dickinson did not publish them as PDFs, if you're wondering. That was done later. So, it is fun to, again, you might think I'm weird because I think this is fun, but it's fun to think about these things being published in the paper. It wasn't like this was a law school exercise where people are reading these things. This was a newspaper article. Right? So pick up the Chesterton Tribune sometime, read Dickinson's letter, and then pick up the Chesterton Tribune and just compare the two. I mean, our newspapers have fallen significantly in the level of intellect. So, all right, Dickinson. A couple more things here about how the colonists responded. There was also another wave of boycotts and harassment of the tax collectors. The boycotts were effective. The amount of product brought from Great Britain to America gets cut in half over about a year's time. And then the same type of harassment, the windows being broken at the offices of the tax collectors, some of them getting tarred and feathered. That would be a very unpleasant experience. That type of thing. So, and we have with that the boycotting, the harassment, Boston becoming a focal point of attention, and actually British troops being sent to Boston in October of 68. And we have the British troops occupying Boston. Again, it's hard to really appreciate the atmosphere that would have been there. But there was already, discontent and unrest and fear of this oppressive government. And then all of a sudden, General Gage is marching into town with troops, and they take up positions around town. They begin setting up checkpoints. And, when you leave town, you've got to show your papers and tell them where you're going. That type of thing begins to happen in Boston. It would have been a very oppressive, ominous feeling. But that was October that happens. All right, so the boycotts, harassment, and Boston here becoming the focal point of attention. So, all right, the last thing we have to look at here with the colonial response is the Boston Massacre. Let me try to give you the emotion of what's happening here. I may not be the best person for that. Maybe my wife can come and cry for you, and she doesn't cry very often either. One of you girls can come up and you can do the emotion for us. The Boston Massacre doesn't take place until March the 5th of 1770. And it's in Boston. Right? So think about when the British troops show up in Boston, October of 68. So we have the fall of 68, all of 69, and then the spring of 70. So a year and a half of Boston being occupied. Yeah, just imagine if, President Obama occupied Chesterton with federal troops for a year and a half. You go into town and you go to Dunkin' Donuts for your morning coffee, and there's some soldiers in line, and they look at you and say, "You stupid Chestertonite," or whatever. They'd come up with a name for us. And there's one guy in line, and 4 of his friends come over and just kind of elbow you out of the way and get in front of you. And then you get mad and you punch them, and they turn around with the butt end of their rifles and smash your face into the ground. And they walk out. Nothing happens. Except you hurt. And then maybe a few weeks later, your face is recovered a little bit, and it's you and 3 or 4 friends. And you happen to see a British soldier by himself, and there's nobody watching. And, a little revenge takes place. Got a year and a half of that type of tension building. Okay? And it's hard to really appreciate the feeling that would have been brewing there on both sides. The British troops getting angry and getting mad, wanting to, I'm going to shoot me a colonist today. And on the other side, Samuel Adams and his buddies at the beer house talking about what they're going to do to the British soldiers. All right, so there was some emotion here and some tension building. All right, that explains a whole lot what happens here at the Boston Massacre. It wasn't just like there's this nice warm spring day and the butterflies are flittering around town and somebody says, "Let's just shoot people." Right? There was an ongoing building of tension. There had been people killed on both sides. You guys maybe can do this better. You can imagine, just mysteriously there's this dead soldier in the back alley in Chesterton behind the Duneland resale shop, just in the stacks of where people drop off donations that they're not supposed to do after there's a dead body in all the clothes, and that type of thing happening. Jennifer's looking disgusted, like, "I'll never go there again." There's no dead bodies back there. I know of. All right, so that is happening in Boston. Then we get here to March of 1770, a year and a half of that type of tension building. And what happened was there was a soldier standing outside a customs house, the office where the people who collected the taxes and all the goods coming in, the office for that agency. And there's a soldier stationed there. You might be able to understand why would it have a soldier stationed there? What's the deal? And there's money there, and there's this ongoing tension. All right, so he's sitting there, some boys show up, and they start throwing snowballs, and as boys often do when you pick up snow. Any of you guys ever not real careful about what else gets picked up? Or maybe sometimes intentionally picking up rocks and packing it in the snowball. So this guy's standing there, and his snowballs are coming at him and other things. He calls for help. Some other soldiers come. So there's a total of 8 of them eventually standing here. The boys, still throwing snowballs. Local residents begin to see more soldiers coming out, so they come out to see what's happening. Someone told me last week they were candy selling, and they drove by a police officer who had stopped somebody, and all the people in the businesses around came out with their cell phones, and they were all videotaping. They wanted to see what was happening. They're going to be on CNN next. Their video, but that type of people coming out to watch, and you can the yelling back and forth, more the colonists yelling, and now we have adults yelling, and the tension building, and we really don't know how it happened. But one of the soldiers fires, and then all of the soldiers fire. The others thinking that the order had been given to fire, and they hadn't heard it in the confusion. When it's all done, 5 of the colonists are killed and 6 are wounded. All right. Again, I used to read that and think, wow, what dirty dogs, these soldiers just firing. I'm not saying that they were innocent people, but they were in a very difficult spot with this mob of angry citizens around them. They probably had friends who had, still had black eyes and broken arms from previous incidents that took place. And they're thinking, I don't want to be the next one. Right? So we really don't know who or how or if the order was given, but the firing took place. 5 killed, 6 are wounded. Now this incident, again, if you can appreciate the emotion and the tension that's building there, gets used intentionally. It's called the Boston Massacre on purpose. That wasn't a name that historians called it. They called it the Boston Massacre. So when they're writing letters with those committees of correspondence, people are hearing about the Boston Massacre. And maybe if they read far enough below the headline, they saw there was 5 killed. That's a safe night in Chicago when only 5 are killed. But anyway, that was intentionally used here to whip up emotions. So if you're interested, there's a trial for those soldiers. There's 8 of them. 6 are found completely innocent. 2 were found guilty of manslaughter and given very, very light charges. All right, so there was a trial. The trial was held here. We held the trial. All right, a very fair trial. Anybody know the guy who was their defendant? John Adams defended them. Right? You can imagine being these soldiers and trying to get a lawyer. Nobody wanted to touch them. Right? But John Adams did. He felt like it was if you're going to have a fair trial, we've got to have a lawyer on their side. So he did it part of his duty. So ends up, he really, lots of people thought his career was over. Obviously that wasn't the case. But he defends them very successfully. If you contrast that with how the British were trying us, dragging us off to their military courts, you can see a significant difference. So, all right, so the Boston Massacre, that was March the 5th of 1770. So, the very, very last thing I said that was last is that the Townshend Acts gets repealed in 1770, except for the tea tax. They left a tax on tea, mostly just to make that statement of defiance. Like, we're going to back off of this because of the uprising. We still have the right to do it, though. Tea tax of 1770. All right, we got one more section to cover. Get out of here. Got 7 minutes. So. 1770, the same year as the Boston Massacre. I don't have the particular date, but it was that same year. All right, we have one more thing to talk about that's on the test, and it's I've got it labeled relative calm. We have a 3-year period here where things settle down. There are some significant things that happen, but there's not. There's Grenville and his program, and Townshend and his program. There's not another guy in England that pops up and says, "All right, let me be the one that sticks the the stick into the hornet's nest and gets them angry." That doesn't happen. So there are some significant things that happen during this time. It's a 3-year span, 1770 to 73. We have this relative calm that takes place. The first thing is really more of a continuation of what had been happening, is the committees of correspondence begin to spread further and become more widespread. So we have this communication between the colonies getting much more thorough. Right. The second thing is an incident involving a British customs ship. It's called the Gaspee, Gaspee. And this particular ship and its captain was very obnoxious and rude and notorious for stopping people and just very rudely barging onto their ship, and had a very, very ugly reputation. So his ship happens to run aground in 1772 off the coast of Rhode Island. And the local citizens come out and pull the crew off. Nobody gets killed. They pull all the crew off and burn the ship not to the ground, burn it to the waterline at least. Burn the whole ship down. England does send over people to investigate, but these people got Hillary Clinton's disease. Nobody remembered anything. Your house is right there by the harbor, and say, "Oh, there's a ship that got burnt out there." And I don't remember that. A ship? Really? Out there? I'll have to go out and look sometime. But nobody knew or saw anything. They never got anywhere trying to figure out who was responsible for this thing. But anyway, that was the Gaspee incident. That was a British customs ship that was notorious and well known for this type of thing. Nobody narked on the other people, to use the high school terminology there. So, all right, the last thing to mention in this relative calm actually is something of serious significance, is that England began to pay the governors and the judges directly. Why is that important? Began to pay them directly. Was it a financial benefit to the colonists? Oh, don't have to worry about that. That's stripped away. Right? So the lower house of the legislature controlling the taxing and spending was their major point of leverage, and now that's getting stripped away with the governor. And then the same thing with the judges. Now all of a sudden the legislatures aren't paying the judges, it's the king paying the judges. All right, so that is a significant thing. If you want to get aggravated at some time, there's all kinds of things to get aggravated, but Paul Ryan, Speaker of the House, in his negotiations with the president, typically will pass the budget and give Obama all the money he wanted, and then negotiate about what Obama is going to give up. If you can, I mean, it's upside down. He capitulates completely on the spending, and then asks the president to comply. He'll get up and say, "Oh, we're fighting hard," and then he approves all the money Obama wants. The one piece of power that they really have to shut down the president if they wanted. They capitulated that. At least in this case, it's being imposed on them by England. It wasn't something we did voluntarily. So governors and judges paid directly from England. A significant change. So, all right, questions on anything? The next thing is a test, but the next topic we'll talk about is the tea tax of 1773. But we'll save that for them. You're dismissed.